So I don't know how you usually. I'll just sort of
usually we don't give like legit intros, but I'm happy.
You don't need to give me a legit intro. I'm saying to start. You do whatever you do.
Okay. I was thinking about it on the ride, over it. So I'll go ahead and I'll do it and let's check that everything is actually going. Okay, everything is good.
And then you drove all the way from Boston, right?
Yeah.
We didn't do.
No intro.
It's okay. I can choose myself.
All right. Thank you all for coming. I'm really pleased to have Heather Albano give a talk to us today. She is a professional writer. She's a game developer. She's released 5 choice of games, one of which, Choice of Zombie, I highly recommend and have played through. She's given talks at GDC and MIT, and she's going to be talking to us partly about interactive fiction.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for having me. So that was a fantastic intro. I was going to start with, my name is Heather and I make games for a living. So yours was much better. So just giving you a quick overview, I usually describe myself as a freelance narrative designer and game writer. I have done most of my work for Choice of Games, which does multiple choice text-based games playable on smartphones and the web. If you liked the old Choose Your Own Adventure books, you will like our games. They're the same general format, but better written if I say it myself. I was also lead writer on Codename Cygnus, which is an interactive audio drama, which is really very cool conceptually, so you should certainly check that out. I've done some RPG supplement writing for Pelgrane Press, and most recently worked with a professor at Suffolk University to create an educational game that teaches different schools of philosophy. The common thread in all of these is that they are text-based, or at least word-based, in the case of Codename Cygnus, not so much with the text. Usually when I am programming, the screen looks something like that, and the game looks something like this. So what I'm about to say about narrative design and player agency is drawn mostly from experiences creating text-based games. But it is applicable to live action, which I can say with some confidence because I've run live action games as a hobby for years, and applicable to video games as well. Anything that's driven by a story should be thinking about how to balance good narrative design with player agency. So let's talk about that. In September 2013, I had the pleasure of being in the audience at the Boston Festival of Independent Games when they had pretty much an all-star cast doing a narrative panel. Brian Moriarty, David Liebling, and Terry Brosius, and they had a bunch of really, really fantastic things to say. The quote that got tweeted the most afterward was this, from Brian: "Games are the art of choice." It made me particularly happy since I do most of my work for a company that has built its business model around meaningful player choice. And it's, it's a great soundbite in and of itself. What's even cooler, though, is that it was part of a really fascinating larger exchange. Soundbites usually are even cooler in context. So Brian said this, and if I remember correctly, it was Dave who countered with, "Yes, but it can be really hard to balance player choice with the desire to tell a coherent story. I mean, you might have a great narrative in your head about the Prince of Denmark who comes home from school to find that his uncle has taken his father's throne and what he does about that. But on the other hand, you want the game sandbox to function realistically for the player, and the player may look at that situation and say, 'Let Uncle Claudius have the throne. I never wanted it anyway. I want to go be a pirate.'" So Brian and David, between them, pretty much articulated the essential tension in the narrative designer's role, the need to balance player agency and good narrative design. On the one hand, you have the kind of game that acts like a functions like a railroad. The type that restricts player agency, I should say, that achieves fantastic narrative at the expense of player agency, is probably the best way to say it. This isn't necessarily a problem. I just phrased it as though it was, but isn't necessarily. If you have a narrative design that's good enough, if it matches the beats of a narrative arc, if it feels classic, if it leads the player to walk away feeling satisfied, then a large percentage of players are not going to care that they can't make narrative-affecting decisions. In the words of a member of my LARP group, I don't mind being railroaded if I'm on the train to Awesome Town. When done badly, however, you get the problem: the story doesn't need the player, and the player can tell. In the same LARP group, we tend to call this the "oops, I forgot to add the interactive" problem. And that's not good. On the other end of the scale, you have the sandbox game, which allows complete player agency, and where the only narrative emerges organically as the player interacts with the system, and whose narrative design is therefore, by definition, non-existent because no one is designing it, it is randomly generated. It is not absolutely impossible for a randomized emergent storyline to match the beats of a classic narrative arc. But it's possible kind of the same way it's possible for an infinite number of these with an infinite number of these to eventually produce that. Given world enough in time, players interacting with a State of Denmark sandbox will eventually produce the tragedy of Hamlet organically through their actions. But in any given playthrough, it is not the way to bet. And while you are waiting for them to organically generate the tragedy of Hamlet, you get to suffer through a bunch of weak, wandering story arcs. And if story is important to you, that's a problem. I've been talking about this as though it's a binary. It's not, it's a continuum. So you can have things like a railroad that runs through a sandbox, where there's one main mission with a good, strong, satisfying narrative arc and a bunch of other stuff you can do if you want. Or this, a railroad with a lot of sandbox with a lot of self-contained railroads in it. Or this, where you get to make choices, but if you pay attention, you notice that they ultimately all feed back into the same narrative railroad. Or perhaps most interestingly, this, where you get to so heavily customize the car you're riding in that the railroad feels different every time, even if it's the same railroad. So, we're talking about a continuum, not a binary. That said, in general, we conceptualize player agency and narrative design as trade-offs. To the point where, if you go online and you see players complaining that in such and such a game, their choices may have impacted their character, but sure didn't impact the story, you also see other players responding with things like this. Partly due to production constraints, and partly due to the writer's desire to tell a coherent story, most games like this don't have dozens of varied endings. My italics. And there's no way any company would have the resources to make a game that fully accounts for every player decision and branches the story accordingly while still hitting the same story beats. Also my italics. There's a fascinating underlying assumption here. We can't incorporate all player decisions and still keep the beats of a good narrative arc. Well, that assumes you can only create one good narrative arc out of any given set of building blocks. That if you have story elements A, B, C, and D, the only good arc you can create with them goes from X to Y to Z in a parabola. And anything else is boring, unsatisfying, and therefore bad narrative design. Or in other words, a railroad where one branch goes to Awesome Town and the rest go to places that no one particularly wants to be. It is understandable that people would be convinced that this is the only possibility. There was a memorable conversation in 2007 between Clive Barker and Roger Ebert, where they used Romeo and Juliet as an example. With Ebert maintaining that the building blocks of Romeo and Juliet are set up to be a tragedy, and that if anyone did anything else with those same building blocks, it would be completely stupid. Those are my words, not his words. I'm paraphrasing, but not by much. He has a point. And this is what I mean when I talk about classic narrative arcs. Emotionally resonant, recognizable. Oh, I'm the protagonist of that story. When you have a play where a boy and girl fall in love at a masked ball, and then they are beset by external forces trying to drive them apart, and then the girl engages in a deceptive plot with a friar to make everyone believe she's dead, and the boy hears the news, believes it to be true, and is heartbroken, at that point you kind of have to end with the poison in the tomb. Anything else would be kind of childish, right? It would be a refusal to grapple with the darkness inherent in the story. If you did anything else, it wouldn't be Shakespeare, right? Except that's the thing. Wouldn't be Romeo and Juliet, but it would be Shakespeare. That's the plot of Much Ado About Nothing. In Much Ado, Hero and Claudio are deeply in love, beset by jealous outsiders. Claudio believes an ugly slander about Hero that is backed up by a truly evil piece of theater that's staged for his benefit. He leaves Hero at the altar. Word spreads through the city that she has killed herself. Claudio is distraught. He hates himself for what he's done. He would do anything to change it back if only he could, but it's too late. Whereupon the ruse is revealed, and he begs Hero for her forgiveness, and they marry. Benedict and Beatrice also sort out their problems and marry. The bad guy gets what's coming to him, and everyone else lives happily ever after. Huzzah. It's a Shakespearean comedy. But the first time I watched Much Ado, it was the Kenneth Branagh version a million years ago, I didn't know the story. And I found myself tensing up at the climax. So, wait a minute, I know this story. This is Romeo and Juliet. That does not end well. I thought this was a comedy. It was. It is. But a Shakespearean comedy and a Shakespearean tragedy are not always distinguishable until you know how they end. You can get two very different, emotionally satisfying, deeply resonant narrative arcs from the same building blocks. So Clive Barker ended his debate with Roger Ebert by saying this: "Let's invent a world where the player gets to go through every emotional journey available." Yeah, let's do that. That sounds great. And let's figure out a way to do it that doesn't break the bank in terms of production cost or designer sanity. Because that's the thing. Games are art. Of course, games are art. I'm an artist. I'm a storyteller. But games are also products, and I am also a businesswoman. I was in consumer electronics for 7 years before I started doing game design professionally. Games are products, and products are things you have to be able to ship. Theory is only so good if you cannot implement it in the real world with real-world constraints. And there are more real-world constraints on video games than there are in text-based games because there are more moving parts. So, let's talk about how we might implement this in the real world. I am not for 1 minute advocating we do this. This is the structure of the very first choose-your-own-adventure novel, The Cave of Time. You start in the middle. Then you decide whether to go left or right. Then once you've decided to go right, you decide to go up the hill or down the hill. This is what most people think of when you say branching. And this is probably what the person a few slides back was thinking of when they said there's no way any company would have the resources to make a game that fully accounts for every player decision and branches the story accordingly. He's right. If you think this is a nightmare to write, code, and debug, you are 100% correct. I speak from experience here. That's why I'm so sure. But more to the point, it is not the, no pun intended, path to good narrative design. The more branches you're dealing with, the less chance you have of doing any of them well, and the less distinct they will be from each other. So, allowing the player to go through every emotional journey is not an achievable goal. Okay. But we could allow the player to go through multiple distinct, satisfying emotional journeys depending on their choices. And then player agency and narrative design wouldn't be working in opposition at all. They would be pedaling the bicycle up the hill together. If we tried to design the 3 or 4 strongest emotional journeys from the same story building blocks, hinged on player choice, we would not be talking about this, or this, or this. We'd be talking about this. So what would that actually look like? If I were going to make the star-crossed lovers game with 2 possible endings, Romeo and Juliet and Hero and Claudio, the first thing I would do is look for the change that causes the difference. I think there's a good argument that one story ends happily and one story ends sadly because Friar Francis is a whole lot more careful than Friar Lawrence when he's setting up his conspiracy. Admittedly, neither friar is the main character, and that weakens this argument a little bit, but they are both absolutely active characters. They are actors who affect the stories in which they dwell, what Shakespeare might have called players in their dramas. So you ask yourself, what action of the player, the friar, changes the arc from a tragedy to a comedy? It happens well before the end scene, but you don't need to branch there. You just need to remember what happened. And then there would be 2 separate end scenes. So up here somewhere, the friar chooses the level of care with which he executes his conspiracy, with which he sets up his conspiracy, and the variable is stored. And down there, and down here, the variable is called, and depending on what it is, 1 of 2 ending scenes play. All the other scenes, falling in love, beset by external forces, separated by these forces, clever plot, everyone thinks the girl is dead, all seems to be lost, are exactly the same scene. The despair on Claudio's face is the same as the despair on Romeo's. In one arc, all seems to be lost is the suspense before the happy ending, and the other, it is a beat in the tragic downward curve. Now let's take a more complicated example. In Choice of Broadsides, a game I co-wrote with Adam Strong-Morse and Dan Fabulich, you play a naval officer in the Napoleonic era, in a secondary world, where you are fighting for Albion against the Gauls. It's a secondary world Horatio Hornblower, very thinly disguised. Early in the game, you are involved in taking an enemy prize ship, at which point you meet Lieutenant Villeneuve, who is fighting for the other side. In the middle of the game, you meet Villeneuve again during a temporary peace between your 2 countries. At the end of the game, you face Villeneuve in battle. These points are hard-coded. In the first encounter, you can treat your prisoner as well as honor demands. You can treat him better than honor demands, so very well that your crew objects. You can treat him with icy politeness, or you can treat him very badly and dishonorably indeed. Depending on what you choose to do, a variable is set. In the second encounter, that variable affects what choices are open to you, effectively breaking it into 2 sub-encounters. The actions you take in the second encounter can take the beginnings of friendship or the beginnings of enmity and dial them back to chilly, polite formality, or it can deepen your mutual friendship or mutual hatred. At one extreme end of the scale, encounter 2 can end with you and Villeneuve fighting a duel at dawn, and at the extreme other end of the scale, you band together to fight off footpads. Depending on how you set your gender and sexuality variables up front, the footpad fight can even end with the option of a love affair. So, depending on what you do in encounter 1 and encounter 2, when you meet Villeneuve in battle, in the climactic scene, you are facing either your star-crossed lover, the person who could have been your dearest friend if not for the unfortunate fact of war separating your countries, your oldest rival, mostly in an intellectual sense, functioning as the face of the opposition, or your bitterest enemy with whom you have many personal scores to settle. All 4 of these are recognizable narrative arcs that feel satisfying. All 4 feel distinctly different from each other. All 4 are driven 100% by upstream player agency. So from the same building blocks, you can get this. Or this. Or this. Or this. The climactic battle scene is the same scene for all 4 arcs. The player has the same options within that scene, no matter how they got there. They have to perform the same actions to win the encounter. The same stat checks determine whether they won or lost. It's the same scene, but it looks completely different to the player who came at it from the star-crossed lover's path than it does to the player who comes at it from the I'll make you pay if it's the last thing I do path. Same building blocks. Different emotional experience. Or in other words, it is worth emphasizing again how that last bit works. Games are art. Art is subjective. 2 players will react very differently to the same scene depending on where they're coming from. Depending on where they're coming from emotionally in their lives, separate from the game, but also depending on what path they took through the game to get there. Games are art. Art is subjective. A different perception of one end scene can change your perception of the entire game. Variable player perception is a tool a designer can deliberately use. And we should. Other forms of art have been doing this for a long time. This is my favorite example. I am about to spoil Babylon 5 in a huge way, okay? But given that the show has been off the air for something like 18 years, I think the statute of limitations has well and truly expired. If you haven't seen it yet, and it's really important to you to remain unspoiled until you do, you should put your hands over your ears while this slide is up, okay? Alright, so in the second episode of Babylon 5, the very first thing they filmed after the pilot, Ambassador Lando Malari, the guy with the hair, reveals that his people have precognitive dreams of how they will die, and he's had his. He has seen his death. It will happen many years in the future, and he will be murdered by Ambassador Jakar, who is the other one, the guy who looks like a lizard. At that time, in the second episode, Lando is a somewhat lovable, somewhat irritating mixture of comic relief and pathos, and Jakar is the antagonist. He's the guy behind half the conspiracy of the weak plots that the good guys foil. And the shape of the arc rolls out in front of you. It's completely recognizable. Jakar is the villain, who eventually is fated to kill the hero, or at any rate the harmless guy, the sidekick. But the harmless guy's sidekick might be able to prevent him from doing a lot of harm between here and there, fighting a holding action. If you were the player piloting Lando, you might find that arc beautiful and sad and satisfying. But in the second season, Lando makes the choice to ally himself with the show's unmitigated bad guys, the true monsters. He slides downhill into villainy, and in response to this, Jakar grows out of being a petty criminal and becomes a freedom fighter. He joins the others in the struggle against the monstrous things that Lando has allied himself with. And the second recognizable arc takes shape. Lando is the once good man whose choices have made him the villain. Jakar is the Dark Knight who started as an antagonist and has become a hero, kinda, sorta. And Lando's reign at villainy will end at his dark heroic hands. That's okay too, even if you're the player piloting Lando, particularly if you've made the choice to play an unrepentant bad guy. You'll probably find this pretty satisfying too. And you might prefer to win, but you know your place in that kind of arc. That'd be okay. But later in the show's run, Lando does repent, and he turns against his horrible allies. He and Jakar grow to be allies themselves, even kinda, sorta friends. As a consequence of Lando's choice to repent, his former allies attach a symbiotic creature to his shoulder, called a Keeper. It is magically invisible to the naked eye and capable of telepathically controlling his actions. Lando discovers it can't hold its liquor And if he drinks just enough, he can send it to sleep and then work around it, doing the things it would stop him from doing. When we finally reach Lando's death scene in real time, we discover that that's what he's been doing. He got to keep her drunk so that he could save the lives of 2 other main characters in the show. We see them run for freedom. And then we see the camera pull back, and Jakar has been watching all this from the shadows behind the throne. Lando turns to him and says, "They'll never make it. Keep her awake. It's going to make me kill them. My old friend, you know what you have to do." And he allows Jakar to strangle him as the ultimate redemptive act. It's the same scene we've gotten twice now in flash forwards. I'm pretty sure they only filmed it once. Only the audience perspective has changed. The show's creator, J. Michael Straczynski, was very active on online bulletin boards when the show was on the air. And his comment on this whole thing was the, if I can get it right, because it's a really, really good quote, it's, "The point isn't how it ends, you know how it ends. We told you how it ends in the 2nd episode. The point is how Lando gets to that place with Jakar's hands around his throat." If you plan it out ahead of time, you can make the same scene function as a certain beat in one arc and a different kind of beat in another arc. I mentioned the "oh my god, she's dead" moment working very differently in Romeo and Juliet versus Hero and Claudia. The 1st and 3rd encounters of the Villeneuve arc are the same no matter what you do in the 2nd. And this applies to a bunch of other things as well. The terrible first meeting of Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy looks very different in the universe where she marries Mr. Darcy than it does in the hypothetical alternate universe where she marries someone else and always perceives him to be the villain. If you default for designing for reuse in this way, you have more flexibility to briefly branch in the places where it matters without breaking your budget or completely derailing your schedule. This does mean you have to architect the entire thing out ahead of time, and that carries its own complications, which we will now discuss in detail. Okay, so how do you design a 4-branch railroad? For starters, you have to know where you're going. You absolutely cannot accomplish this by starting the story at the beginning, branching every time it seems as though here would be a good place to offer the PC an interesting choice, and oh crap, now I have another branch I have to make awesome. You can trust me on this because I have made this mistake. I speak from experience. To keep the railroad metaphor going, no one in history has ever laid train track randomly on a prairie and then tried to make the random endpoint into a place the passengers want to be. You build the towns first, then you lay the track that goes from here to there. So you don't start at the beginning and work forward, you start at the end and work backward. You think about the end experiences you want your player to have, and you figure out what all the steps are to construct them. You might choose to view this as starting at the beginning and the end and figuring out the arcs that connect the two. What are all the ways Lando gets to that place with Jakar's hands around his throat? What are all the stories that begin with 2 young officers from opposing sides of a war meeting and ends with the same 2 officers facing off in battle? Okay, so you've brainstormed a bunch of stuff. Of these potential stories, which 3 or 4 are the most interesting? 3 or 4, seriously, 3 or 4. Not one real one, and some others you threw in because somebody told you branching was a good thing. That's this. And not 20, not even if you think you have 20 good ideas. That's this. You probably don't have 20 equally good ideas, and even if you do, you will not be able to execute them all well. The more you have, the less well you'll be able to do each one, the less distinct they'll be from each other. Save some of your ideas for your next game. Okay, so you've got your 3 or 4 arcs. Now what do? You start thinking about what beats you need to hit. That guy in the slide a while ago talked about story beats, to construct those stories. You divide your arcs into scenes. two of the Villeneuve stories might look like this. I met a Gaulish officer is the same scene for both. I treated him kindly versus badly. It's obviously different. We met again years later, same beat. He remembered my kindness, and we fought off bandits together versus he insulted me and we fought a duel. Now I am ordered to kill him. Two very different stories. You get the idea. Now that you've got the beats, you ask yourself, what choices made by the protagonist result in the beat of one arc versus the beat of another? Make the train switch from one track to another. This is a simple-ish example, so it's pretty easy to see where it is. There's one choice, it's right there, and then the differences are the consequences of that one. So you figure out what you divide your arcs into scenes, you divide your scenes into choices, and those are the choices you offer your player, along with any cosmetic designing the train car ones you feel like offering. It is important to show the player that their choices have consequences. But all other scenes should be crafted to be arc-agnostic, and the player's perceptions will fill in the rest. So now you know what to do. You write, in this particular case, one scene to start with that ends with a player choice. You write two versions of this one to show the consequences of the player choice, two versions of this one to show the consequence of the player choice, and one version of the end scene that the player will interpret differently depending on the path he or she took to get there. You are signing up to craft 6 scenes instead of 4, which is indeed half again the expense when measured in time, schedule, designer compensation, assets, production cost, disk footprint, and all the rest of it. Obviously, it is not without cost to design this way. But I want to emphasize that the cost is incremental rather than directly proportional. For half again the cost, you have created twice as much game, 2 distinct emotional journeys, and you've given your player the agency to choose their protagonist's character arc. I personally think it is worth the investment. A couple of other best practices are worth mentioning. Instead of designing a huge branching tree that looks like that, where you go out the front door or the back and then up the hill or down the hill, and remember variables and assign a sequence of stacked bushes. Stacked bushes are Choice of Games co-founder Dan Fabulich's answer to the big branching Choose Your Own Adventure tree. In this model, the scenes are always the scenes. The prize ship encounter is always followed by the lieutenant's exam, and then the cutting out mission, and then the peacetime sequence, and then your first command, and then your final encounter with Villeneuve. I have had people respond to this by saying, well, it does restrict player choice, to which I always say, it absolutely does. I've never pretended we're writing the sandbox here. You can't go off and be a pirate, like in Dave Liebland's example, except in this game you actually can. There's a failure ending where your crew mutinies and you can choose to be a pirate rather than be killed by them. So that's kind of a bad example. But it's not a sandbox. You can't go off and be a cavalry officer. But the choices given to the player are meaningful. The arcs are all cool. And designing it in a sequence of bushes makes it manageable for the designers. It works in 2 ways. Variables you set up here can restrict the variables that are available down here, which is a very simple if-then-else kind of statement. And it gives you the opportunity to play with perception, as I have been talking, where the choices available down here look different depending on the choices you made up here. Every time you confront NPC X in this scene, you have the choice to let her go or to kill her. Is she a freedom fighter or a terrorist? It depends who you've decided you sympathize with. Every time you meet NPC Y in the scene, you can accept or reject their marriage proposal. Is the marriage proposal an obstacle to be avoided or a victory to be celebrated? Depends which suitor you've decided you want. You get the idea. Stacked bushes are easier if you use a sliding scale instead of Boolean variables. So a Boolean variable can only set a true or false statement. So thinking about the Villeneuve relationship, You could do that as a sequence of true or false. So your first encounter breaks down into a number of small choices where you can speak to him in Gaulish or not. You can give him medical supplies for his people or not. You can return his sword or not. And there's some other stuff that I'm forgetting. So one way to do this is to set a true false for each one of those. And then when you get to scene 2, encounter 2, you can run a check that is something like, if sword equals true and medical supplies equals true and Gaulish equals true, else if Gaulish equals false but the other two equal true, else if, or you could not do it that way, and you could have one variable, which is what we did, the rel Villeneuve variable, which is a number, and increments, goes up or down depending on each choice you make. And the second time you see him, if it's above 50, he likes you. And if it is below 50, he does not. And that's obviously something you can do with even more granularity, where if it's above 75, he really likes you, and if it's below 25, he hates you, and in the middle there's middle ground. So here we go. The recipe for creating a branching railroad. Now, having said all this, don't get me wrong, it is really, really hard to architect this way. I personally have not managed it more than I have managed it. Although, having said that, I think I might finally have nailed it in Choice by Gaslight, which is due out from the Choice of Games Hosted Games program in November. If you happen to play it, please do feel free to email me and let me know if you think I got it this time. But joking about recipes aside, this is not a recipe, this is an ideal. It's an aspiration. But I think it's the ideal that every narrative designer should be working toward. In this ideal, narrative design and player agency work together instead of in opposition to each other, and by working together are able to take the player to all the awesome places they may choose to go. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. This is me on social media, and one of these days I'm going to replace that picture with one that looks more the way I look now that I'm not dyeing my hair. But for the moment, this is me on social media. And I think we have, what, about 5 minutes for questions?
Yeah, we got time.
Yeah, we can take, let's take 10 minutes.
Anyway, I want to count.
Yeah.
Okay, so early on, hey everyone, I'm Tim Shaw. I have no professional affiliation to speak of, so that's me. You spoke very early on when we started meeting about, getting things out there early and showing it to people and seeing how they react. So I just want to stress the prototype I've been working on in my spare time. So I like couch multiplayer games a lot. And an old one that I've not seen well recreated was for the Atari 2600, a game called Warlords. Anybody's familiar with that? All right. It is essentially a 4-player version of Breakout, where you have a little fort that is guarding.
Oh, I've seen that.
Yeah.
They have it in the Atari arcade. You know, the little arcade thing?
Oh, do they?
Yeah. I should bring this one.
The thing that made it
Warlord,
the best version of it, and I know it exists in several versions, it's been redone on the Xbox, but the Atari 2600 had a paddle with a dial you spun, and spinning was just such this important action game for me that I wanted to try to capture that. And so I have been working on a game which I call Wizlord, actually Wizorb, but that was taken. Everything is taken. And they didn't even have the decency to name the character of their game Wizorb. It was just, the magic is Wizorb.
This is a website there. Most of the stuff, there's no website. It's just squatters.
So, let's see what we got here. All right. All right. Actually, I'm going to play into the forums. Bet I can get somebody to play this with me. Anyone?
I'll play.
All right, good.
Everyone for the full 4-player?
We'll keep it
Superman
simple.
needs to be playing Warlord all his life.
I'll just turn this stuff off to simple, and go for the wide one. In fact, will work. All right.
Is it off
So
the screen?
what's that?
Is it off the screen?
I don't know. Hang on a second. We will not play the wide one. My technical artistry is not great, so. Oh, hey, we got walls now too.
Yeah.
All right. The point of the game is to take that orb, grab it, and then fling it into your opponent's little pylon in the corner. And so, if you will spin the right joystick, that is.
You rigged me. No.
Oh, well, okay. All right, I'll just talk about this. You can try it afterwards. I win. So, to capture the spinning that I talked about, I've got a little control point here. That's how you grab the orb. And then, oh crap. And so, let's see. You grab the orb, you fling the orb, that was an important part. The other important part was having walls. So, you can put walls down and guard your pylon.
When it inevitably turns into a lava spewing rock of death.
Yep. What? It's crazy. That was a good shot, though. That'll give me a point. And in fact, to try to encourage distance play, I made it so the longer the ball travels without bouncing, the more points you get. Because otherwise, the dominant strategy is to walk over, catch the thing, and just do this.
Why is it so big? What happened? I don't.
Yeah. And so, I don't know. Thematically, I intend to make these kind of crazy events that the orb does something that reacts to what the player has done. And they are now, actually. You'll notice that I win.
That was really fun.
Yeah, it is fun.
So this spinning, I thought that was like it was almost required, but then after you were kind of like not even using it and just. So what's the point of this spinning part?
Well, it's how you aim. It is really just all that there is to that.
Oh, okay.
Although grabbing it and then swinging it around into people.
Because I was thinking if that increased like the velocity of it or something, then you would need to spin it.
I did start with sort of a slinging sort of firing method, and it's really hard to hit them. So I might go back to that or just work it in at various points.
Okay.
You could like charge up as you spin.
Yeah, just really put some
That's how you make a giant.
heat on it or whatever.
Yeah.
A power move, I think, would be a great,
Yeah, so my long-term plans, I guess, because I'm going to keep working on this, are to make the orb do all sorts of crazy things, to narrate how it is abusing you, which was a little bit in there, but it's very quiet off the laptop speakers, and to sort of aggregate the player actions, because at the end of a match, it's always fun to have those superlatives, like the most grabby, or building walls.
Melee specialist.
But throughout the match, I'm trying to keep track of those so that they determine how the orb starts to like counteract what you've done. So if you drop a certain number of walls, it goes crazy and starts breaking them, which is actually in there.
Oh, so that's why those events are happening, is based on what the players are doing?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
I'm sure that's more than 5 minutes, so
Yeah,
afterwards
no.
I'd be happy to show it more.
Okay,
I
great.
have 4 controllers.
Oh, nice. All right, great. Well, thank you very much. All right, I guess
guess okay. I think we're done with show and tells, and now just